May 1st, 1945. London. Downing Street was quiet in a way it had not been for 6 years. Germany was collapsing. Berlin was encircled. Victory in Europe was no longer a matter of planning, only timing. In a private room away from the cabinet chamber, Winston Churchill convened a restricted meeting with Britain's senior military planners. No ministers were present. No Allied representatives were invited. The war in Europe was not yet finished, and already the next war was being discussed. Churchill did not ask for a study. He issued an instruction. The British chiefs of staff were ordered to prepare a plan for a full-scale offensive against the Soviet Union. This was not a defensive contingency. It was not an abstract exercise. It was to be a practical operational plan, capable of execution on a fixed date. The target was the Red Army, deployed across Central and Eastern Europe. The objective was to impose the will of the Western Allies upon the Soviet Union by force of arms. The proposed start date was set without ambiguity, July 1st, 1945. The orders stunned the room. The Soviet Union was, at that moment, Britain's formal ally. Soviet forces were still fighting German units. British and Soviet officers were coordinating occupation zones. Publicly, Churchill was preparing speeches celebrating Allied unity and shared sacrifice. Privately, he was directing his generals to calculate how to break that alliance by violence. There was no recorded debate. No vote was taken. The decision did not pass through Parliament. It did not involve Washington. The instruction was given orally and then confirmed through classified channels. The plan would be given a deliberately unsettling name, Operation Unthinkable. When the meeting ended, the chiefs of staff left with their task defined and their discretion limited. They were to determine how to fight the largest army on Earth with forces already exhausted by 6 years of war. The decision had been made. The consequences would follow. In purely military terms, the moment Churchill issued his order was not one of desperation. It was one of fleeting leverage. In early May 1945, the Western Allies still possessed something they would soon lose: concentrated, intact forces in continental Europe. British, American, Canadian, and Polish formations stood deep inside defeated Germany. Their logistics were functional. Their command structures were unified. Air superiority was absolute. For a brief window, the machinery of Allied war power still existed in one place, under one operational system. The Red Army, despite its size, was stretched. Soviet forces were deployed across a vast arc from the Baltic to the Balkans. They were victorious, but not rested. Many formations had been fighting continuously since the Vistula-Oder offensive. Equipment losses were immense. Units were reorganizing even as they advanced. Command cohesion depended heavily on momentum and fear, not replenishment. From a planner's perspective, this created a theoretical opening. If a blow were struck immediately, before American demobilization and redeployment to the Pacific, the Western Allies could assemble a concentrated strike force in central Germany. The initial axis envisioned was toward Poland, aimed at rolling back Soviet forward armies before strategic depth could absorb the shock. Air power was the most obvious advantage. Western Allied bombers operated without meaningful opposition. Soviet air defenses were dense, but localized. Control of the air would allow interdiction of Soviet supply lines, disruption of reserves, and paralysis of rear-area movement. On paper, this gave the West a temporary operational superiority disproportionate to its ground numbers. Naval power also mattered. The Soviet Union had no capacity to threaten the Atlantic. Britain's sea lines of communication were secure. Reinforcements, fuel, and material could flow without interference. This was a one-sided condition that would not exist if the war dragged on or if the United States withdrew its commitment. There was also the matter of geography. Central Europe offered terrain favorable to mobile warfare. Rivers ran east to west, not north to south, complicating Soviet counteroffensives. German infrastructure, though damaged, still supported mechanized movement better than the road networks further east. The battlefield, if forced early, would favor speed and coordination over mass alone. Most critically, time itself was a weapon. Every week that passed reduced Western strength. American divisions were already earmarked for transfer to the Pacific. Political pressure for demobilization was rising rapidly in both Britain and the United States. Soviet strength, by contrast, was increasing. Occupation forces were solidifying control. Defensive belts were being organized. Intelligence networks were expanding westward. The planners understood this imbalance clearly. Any opportunity existed only in early summer 1945, before the alliance fully dissolved into peacetime structures. After that, the window would close permanently. This was the opportunity Churchill believed he saw. Not a guarantee of victory, not even a high probability of success, but a narrow, vanishing moment in which force could still be applied before political reality made war impossible. It was a military calculation stripped of sentiment. It assumed speed, surprise, and total commitment. And it depended on one condition above all others: that the Western Allies would act immediately, together, and without hesitation. That condition would not survive contact with institutions designed to avoid exactly that kind of war. The warning did not come as protest or panic. It arrived as calculation. Once the order was issued, the British Joint Planning Staff did what they had been trained to do. They stripped the question of politics and examined it as a problem of force, space, and endurance. Their task was not to advise whether the decision was wise. It was to determine whether it was possible. Their first step was to define the enemy honestly. The Red Army was not treated as a worn-down ally. It was assessed as a coherent, experienced, and ruthlessly effective force. Soviet formations in Europe numbered in the millions. They had crushed the Wehrmacht in its own territory. They had adapted to modern, mechanized warfare under conditions far worse than anything the Western Allies had endured. The planners did not underestimate them. The second step was to examine Western strength without optimism. British and American armies were intact, but they were tired. Casualties had hollowed out veteran units. Equipment was worn. Ammunition stocks were adequate for defense, not prolonged continental warfare. The planners noted that morale was high but conditional. These were soldiers who believed the war was ending, not beginning again. Then came the arithmetic. Soviet ground forces outnumbered Western Allied forces in Europe by a wide margin. Not marginally, decisively. In tanks, artillery, and infantry, the imbalance was stark. Even assuming full American participation, the West would be attacking an enemy with superior numbers, fighting on ground the enemy already occupied. The planners tested scenarios. They examined surprise attacks, rapid thrusts, exploitation of air power, and aggressive operational tempo. In every model, the same problem emerged. Initial advances were possible. Soviet forward units could be disrupted. Territory might be seized. But the Red Army's depth absorbed losses in a way the Western Allies could not match. Soviet reserves were vast and close. Western reserves were limited and politically fragile. Logistics became the decisive warning. The Western Allies depended on long supply lines running back to ports and depots. The Soviets operated on interior lines, supported by rail networks oriented east to west. Even with air superiority, cutting those lines permanently was unrealistic. The planners concluded that any offensive would slow rapidly, then stall, then invite counterattack. They also addressed the unspoken assumption behind Churchill's thinking that the Soviet system might fracture under pressure. There was no evidence for this. Soviet command structures were centralized, brutal, and resilient. Political collapse was not a military variable. The planners treated it as irrelevant. The final assessments were written in restrained language. There were no dramatic warnings, no emotional appeals. The documents simply stated that success depended on conditions unlikely to be sustained. They noted that failure would not be limited to the battlefield. A failed offensive would expose Western Europe itself to occupation. This was the warning, not a refusal, not dissent. A professional conclusion reached by men who understood exactly what they were being asked to unleash. They had shown that the plan could be drawn. They had also shown that it could not be controlled once begun. The overrule did not arrive as a single refusal. It emerged as pressure applied from every direction Churchill could not control. The first constraint was institutional. The British chiefs of staff did not oppose the Prime Minister directly, but their conclusions carried weight precisely because of their restraint. They framed Operation Unthinkable not as reckless, but as strategically unsustainable. This mattered. A plan described as impossible can be argued with. A plan described as uncontrollable cannot. Once that language entered the internal record, the initiative began to lose momentum. The second force was American reality. Any offensive against the Soviet Union required full United States participation. Britain alone could not execute it. Yet Churchill did not command American armies, nor did he control American political priorities. In Washington, the war had already shifted focus. Japan remained undefeated. Casualty projections for the Pacific were catastrophic. Every American division kept in Europe was one not preparing for Okinawa, Kyushu, or the mainland. President Truman had inherited Roosevelt's commitments, but not his patience for improvisation. He was new, cautious, and acutely aware of domestic opinion. The American public had endured 4 years of war with a clear moral narrative. Germany was the enemy. Japan was next. The Soviet Union was an ally. To reverse that narrative overnight would require justification no military briefing could provide. There was also alliance management. The Anglo-American command structure was held together by trust barely preserved through the final months of the war. Any perception that Britain was dragging the United States into a new conflict for imperial or ideological reasons risked fracture. American generals, already skeptical of British strategic judgment after costly operations, were unwilling to stake their forces on a war their electorate had not approved. The most decisive overrule, however, came from politics at home. Britain was exhausted. The economy was shattered. Rationing remained in place. Millions of servicemen expected demobilization, not redeployment. An election was imminent. Churchill, despite his stature, was not insulated from democratic consequence. A new war, launched in secrecy against a former ally, would have been indefensible once exposed. Churchill understood this. He did not contest the planners' conclusions. He did not press the Americans publicly. He did not escalate the proposal within cabinet. Instead, he allowed the process to end quietly. The files were classified at the highest level. Distribution was restricted. The plan was not canceled in dramatic fashion. It was simply buried. This was not retreat through persuasion. It was containment through structure. The institutions of alliance warfare, designed to prevent unilateral action, functioned exactly as intended. They absorbed the impulse and neutralized it without confrontation. Churchill remained convinced of his strategic diagnosis. He did not abandon his view of Soviet intent, but he accepted the limits of his power. Without American backing, without public consent, and without a military path that promised control, the decision could not be executed. The overrule was complete not because Churchill changed his mind, but because the system ensured he could not act alone. The consequence unfolded not as an explosion, but as a release of pressure in one direction and its accumulation in another. Once Operation Unthinkable was sealed away, the Western Allied posture changed almost immediately. Demobilization accelerated. American divisions began their scheduled withdrawal from Europe. Equipment was mothballed or shipped west. British forces consolidated occupation zones rather than reinforcing forward positions. What had briefly been a unified, battle-ready mass dissolved into administrative commands and garrisons. The Red Army observed this shift without ambiguity. Soviet intelligence required no access to British planning documents to understand what was happening. Force movements told the story. Western armies were not preparing for confrontation. They were preparing to go home. That signal mattered more than any speech. With no fear of immediate challenge, Soviet commanders moved to secure what they already occupied. Eastern Europe transitioned from battlefield to controlled space. Provisional governments were reorganized. Opposition groups were neutralized. Borders hardened. Rail lines and supply hubs were repurposed for occupation rather than advance. What had been fluid became fixed. The most immediate consequence was strategic asymmetry. The West relinquished initiative, not through defeat, but through choice. The Soviet Union emerged from the war with the largest standing army in Europe and no opposing force position to contest it. This was not the result of a treaty clause or diplomatic betrayal. It was the direct outcome of the decision not to fight when fighting was still possible. Military consequences followed predictable patterns. Soviet forces remained mobilized. Their logistics adapted to peacetime control without demobilization. Officer corps retained wartime authority. Western forces, by contrast, lost cohesion rapidly. Veteran units were broken up. Experience dispersed. Command structures flattened. The ability to conduct large-scale operations in Europe vanished within months. Political consequences were inseparable from this military reality. Governments in Warsaw, Prague, Budapest, and Bucharest understood the balance of power clearly. There would be no Western intervention. Resistance movements that had hoped for Allied backing found themselves isolated. Their suppression was not a matter of speculation, but of time and method. In Germany itself, the consequences were geographic and permanent. The country was divided along lines of occupation that had originally been provisional. Those lines became borders. Infrastructure, industry, and population were reorganized around them. The idea of a unified post-war settlement faded as quickly as Western forces withdrew from contested zones. The British chiefs of staff had warned that a failed offensive would expose Western Europe to occupation. What they had not needed to warn was that inaction would expose Eastern Europe to certainty. That certainty arrived without a shot being fired. For Churchill personally, the consequence was isolation. His strategic warning found no immediate outlet in policy. He would later articulate it publicly, but by then the conditions he had feared were already entrenched. His removal from office in July 1945 ensured that even informal pressure ceased. Britain's new government prioritized recovery, welfare, and stability. Confrontation was politically unthinkable even as the plan bearing that name lay in a locked file. The American position hardened into one of containment rather than prevention. This was a reactive posture by definition. It accepted the post-war balance as fixed and sought only to prevent further expansion. The cost of that acceptance would be paid over decades, in crises rather than campaigns. The absence of war in 1945 did not produce peace. It produced stasis under tension. Armies faced each other across new frontiers. Intelligence services replaced divisions as the forward edge of conflict. Nuclear weapons became substitutes for maneuver. The battlefield did not disappear. It was postponed and abstracted. For the soldiers who had expected to come home, this consequence was invisible. They returned to civilian life believing the war had ended cleanly. For the populations east of the new divide, the consequence was immediate and enduring. Political systems were reshaped under supervision. Military presence became permanent. Choice narrowed. Operation Unthinkable was never executed, but its shadow shaped what followed. The decision not to act allowed another power to act without resistance. The planners' fear of uncontrollable escalation was justified. So was Churchill's fear of uncontested dominance. The consequence was not catastrophe in the short term. It was structure, a divided continent, armed camps facing each other without engagement, a peace defined not by settlement, but by exhaustion and fear. All of it traced back to a moment when force still existed in balance, and the choice was made to stand down rather than strike. The post-war record removed any doubt about what had been contemplated and why it failed. For half a century, Operation Unthinkable existed only as rumor. British governments denied it. Officials deflected questions. Churchill himself never mentioned it publicly. The silence was deliberate. Acknowledging the plan would have forced uncomfortable admissions about how close the Allies came to turning on each other while victory celebrations were still underway. When the files were finally declassified in the late 1990s, they revealed no dramatization, no ideological manifesto, no crusade. They revealed staff papers, tables, force ratios, casual assessments written in unemotional language. The documents confirmed that the plan had been real, detailed, and time-bound. They also confirmed that it had been abandoned not out of moral hesitation, but because the mathematics of war made success implausible. The planners' conclusions aged well. Subsequent Soviet archives, opened after the Cold War, showed that Red Army strength in mid-1945 had been even greater than Western estimates. Soviet logistics were strained, but resilient. Reserves existed at scale. Command cohesion remained intact. The assumption that Soviet control of Eastern Europe might fracture under pressure proved unfounded. Where resistance emerged, it was suppressed with methods the Western allies were unwilling to employ. Churchill's own post-war writings are revealing for what they include and what they omit. He described the wartime alliance with the Soviet Union as one of necessity, not trust. He documented his frustration at conferences where territorial outcomes were effectively conceded. But he did not record the specifics of the July 1945 plan. By the time he published his memoirs, the strategic landscape had already hardened. The opportunity he had perceived no longer existed. Recording it would have served no purpose. What did emerge publicly was his broader conclusion. In 1946, speaking in the United States, he described a continent divided by an iron curtain. That phrase was not rhetorical invention. It was a summary of conditions already established. The line he described ran through territories that had been uncontested since the summer of 1945. The speech did not predict the division of Europe. It acknowledged it. American records from the same period reinforced the British assessment. U.S. military planners, examining hypothetical conflict with the Soviet Union in the late 1940s, reached even bleaker conclusions. Without nuclear monopoly, conventional war in Europe was judged unwinnable. With nuclear weapons, it was judged catastrophic. The window Churchill had contemplated closed rapidly and permanently. From the Soviet perspective, the absence of a Western challenge confirmed their assumptions. They interpreted demobilization not as restraint, but as weakness. Post-war Soviet doctrine emphasized rapid occupation, political consolidation, and forward defense. The goal was to ensure that no future opportunity for rollback could arise. In this, they succeeded. The historical record therefore resolves the question cleanly. Operation Unthinkable was not a fantasy, nor was it a viable alternative path. It was an expression of strategic fear confronted by institutional reality. It failed not because it was hidden, but because it could not survive scrutiny. In hindsight, the plan's true significance lies not in what it might have achieved, but in what it reveals about the moment. In May 1945, the alliance that had defeated Germany was already finished in substance, if not in form. The war ended, but alignment did not endure. The documents closed the case. There was no lost chance to reshape Europe by force without consequence. There was only a narrow interval in which violence could have escalated beyond control. That escalation was avoided. The division that followed was not an accident, and it was not imposed overnight. It was the stable outcome of decisions made when exhaustion outweighed ambition. By the time the public learned the name Operation Unthinkable, its world had long since come into being. The case closes with no ambiguity. Operation Unthinkable was not a bluff, not a rumor, and not a footnote inflated by hindsight. It was a real directive issued at the highest level, examined by professional soldiers, and abandoned for reasons that were neither sentimental nor naive. Churchill's judgment of Soviet intent proved accurate. Eastern Europe did not drift into Moscow's orbit by accident. It was secured deliberately, systematically, and without meaningful resistance. The political order that followed was not improvised. It was imposed under the protection of overwhelming force. His judgment of military feasibility did not. The war he contemplated could not be controlled, contained, or concluded on acceptable terms. The imbalance of manpower, the fragility of Allied cohesion, and the absence of public mandate made success unlikely and failure potentially terminal. This was not a matter of courage or will. It was arithmetic. The system worked as designed. Civilian politics constrained military ambition. Alliance structures prevented unilateral escalation. Exhaustion overruled foresight. A second global war did not begin in 1945 because the institutions of victory were unwilling to carry it further. What followed was not peace. It was division without combat. An armed standoff replacing open conflict. Borders hardened. Armies remained mobilized. Fear became policy. Europe stabilized, but only by freezing the results of power rather than resolving them. Churchill left office convinced he had been right about the future and powerless to alter it. His warning would later be remembered. His plan would remain buried. History did not vindicate his solution, but it did confirm his diagnosis. No alternative path existed that avoided cost. One choice risked immediate catastrophe. The other accepted long-term confrontation. The latter prevailed not because it was cleaner, but because it was survivable. Operation Unthinkable ended as a file, not a campaign. Its legacy was not bloodshed, but structure. A divided continent. A prolonged Cold War. A reminder that even victorious leaders operate inside limits they do not control. The record is complete. If you want more investigations into the decisions that shaped the 20th century from closed rooms rather than battlefields, consider subscribing. If you disagree with the verdict, leave a comment. The case itself is no longer open.